he wanted to join as well. You can couldn't, yeah, sure. And Gonzalez is there.
And Zurich are also joining, but they're setting up.
They're setting up?
Yes.
Okay.
Carlo will come.
Okay, great.
Where's Ludger?
Yeah, Ludger has, he will join for the drinks afterwards.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, he has Sitzung now in Zurich. But by 6 he'll be over, and there are guys from...
So we'll have virtual drinks with Ludger?
We'll have virtual drinks with them.
Okay, excellent. Digital drinks.
Yeah. And Zurich is getting set up. Should we take a bit? Great, that is name on a holiday. When I planned this, I didn't know that it's a holiday period. So, yeah, we start, huh?
You want to start?
You ready?
Sure.
I'm very, very happy, and I say deliberately because Gregg last year, I think, told me you are the person who uses that word very extensively. But I still think it's adequate. I'm really happy to welcome Lambert here for the first time since I am in Vienna. I'm sure he will be coming back. We are actually planning to establish some sort of collaboration long term. Gregg Lambert, I will start by introducing him on a personal level, that's where I relate more, and then of course on an academic level as well. He was in the very first conference that I ever attended in terms of academic conferences. It was the first Deleuze camp. For those of you who are a little bit in Deleuze scholarship, probably saw that this has become a huge thing. I think it has been copied like 10 times in all the continents worldwide. But when it started, that was, I think, 2004 or 5, something like that. In Cardiff, it was quite small, actually, for people interested in research on this Deleuzean philosophy, whom Foucault said is going to be, was it Foucault? Foucault said Deleuze is going to be the big philosopher of the next century. So that's more than 12, 13 years ago. But since then we've been in touch, and Gregg has been one of my mentors, I can say, and still is. He is honorary professor at Syracuse University, which is in New York. It's not New York City, but New York State. And you have been, where to start? Heavily engaged in keeping the humanities alive in the US, which is quite a task today. And not only the humanities in terms of the liberal arts tradition, but also and especially in terms of continental philosophy. So he did his PhD thesis, when was it? In the 90s, huh?
95, 96?
96? Yeah, under the direction of Jacques Derrida. Still one of the key influences in your work, I think, together with Deleuze. And was teaching a lot worldwide, with collaborations in the Netherlands, in Australia, in Asia, in Korea for many years now. And always with the focus also on the institutional role of the humanities and the role of institutions for contemporary life, you could say. Yeah. So in a time when institutions are getting industrially privatized in many ways, so companies building new universities themselves have to sell themselves quite literally to industry funding and so on. This old question by Kant on the conflict of the faculties. Who creates the curriculum? Who is to create the curriculum of the general education? One of the core values of the Enlightenment that is still very, very dear to me as well. So you wrote a report to the Academy, picking up Kant's book and also Lyotard's report, of course, on the postmodern condition, to raise all these questions in a humanist sense to an anonymous audience in a certain way. And a lot of the institutional initiatives have continued to pursue exactly this gesture. So where all the publishers will insist that you name your audience so they can target your publication and your title and everything, there is something in all the initiatives, at least those that I know, that you were involved in bypassing exactly this kind of gesture. And it's say, no, I'm sending out a letter and I'm looking forward to by whom it will be received. And I'm very, very fond of precisely this gesture. There is among different such initiatives one which is called the Society for the Study of Biopolitical Futures, which was meant to be, you founded it 6 years ago, I think, something like that?
Yeah, about 6 years ago, yeah.
So it was meant to be an impermanent institution, no? So an institution that would prevent itself from becoming institutional in the sense which we are not so fond of, by having been planned from the beginning to last only for so long.
Yeah.
And I'm happy it's for now still lasting. There's going to be conferences next year, so it's good to hear from year to year that it's still there.
To decide whether to end the institution or to continue. So
Exactly.
this would be the question. Yeah.
And then there is a transdisciplinary media studio with the Syracuse University School of Architecture. There is the Perpetual Peace Project, another project which picks up Kantian philosophy, the question of perpetual peace, in collaboration with the United Nations University, the International Peace Institute, the Institutes of Culture in the Netherlands, in the US, in several places in Europe as well. And he's currently again starting more to teach, because teaching becomes more important for the future, which is something as well that I understand very much. So yeah, it's just great to work with young people on not so much on the structures and the frameworks, but on the content and on the themes. So among his books, I want to highlight especially the book to the Academy, which unfortunately I couldn't find right now. I would have showed you. There is another one which for architects I think is very interesting. It's called On the New Baroque. So it's one of the conferences that you attended in Switzerland that I was organizing. Gregg gave a paper which was called the Baroque Tsunami, and it created quite some tumult. It was in the library Werner Oechslin, of course a very Baroque place in Switzerland, and the perspective from which you looked at it was not precisely the perspective that they like to continue, but it triggered enormously interesting discussions. It's this series of conferences, it's called Megalithicum. We have 4 books from it, and I think in 2 of them there are lectures by you. So if you are interested afterwards, we're going to have drinks upstairs, and you're welcome to have a look. And then a last piece, because this is a side which I didn't know at all, that would actually interested actively in writing poetry as well.
Mm-hmm.
And one little piece is in this special edition on tables, which we are starting now. So we invited people to write on architectonic objects. For the first time it was the table. And you actually wrote the myth of tableness, we could say, something like that.
Yeah.
And in a very similar kind of gesture to, again, raise an interest in origins, in beginnings, in time, in temporality, is also the program that you scheduled for the lecture today, Reflections on the Silurian Lake. And the Silurian Lake, perhaps just as a quick introduction, because I wasn't sure whether this is the context, refers to one of these 2 really, really massive periods of extinction before the appearance of humans on Earth. And it's from there that you want to bring some things back into the present, I guess, with the reflections. Huh?
Yeah, I'll try to. I'll try to frame the lecture to give a kind of to pad a little bit, but also to give some context for understanding how I'm approaching this.
Where you're coming.
Yeah.
Yes. I'm looking very forward to hearing more. Please welcome Gregg Lambert.
Well, this is very important, and particularly I met Vera 13 years ago, and we've been intellectual itinerants or companions along the way, and I've always maintained an intellectual and dialogue on the projects that Vera is doing. I'm very, very pleased to see this space, this institution, and particularly the notion of the abstract, how that can be instantiated, how that can be made institutional as a space. It's very unique. I just wanted to say that I can already tell, I mean, knowing Vera, but I could already tell that what's happening here is is very unique and timely, given, I would say, probably more pessimistic or Baroque events that are happening in other nations, including the United States and North America and elsewhere, where the university is particularly in the role of the humanities and so forth, is losing some of its vitality through privatization and through financialization. So I'm very, very happy to see places of research that emerge within these contexts. So thank you for inviting me. I want to, so this lecture was chosen by Vera. I said choose anything from the academia, but I knew that she would choose this one. So I wanted to give you some context for this. This has undergone 3 different versions, but all the versions are part of my reflection. So the notion of reflection on the Silurian lake. In the first version, it was reflection on the emergence of the theme or the notion of the Anthropocene in the humanities, and as well as the notion of writings on extinction, on writings on the notion of either the Anthropocene or of the turning point, the singularity that human populations have created ecologically and so forth, and that there was a rush or a kind of a market movement, a speculative market movement of a lot of writings on the Anthropocene that occurred at a certain moment. And so my question is always, why? Why now? Why at this moment? Given that these problems have been with us for so long, and what are the current geopolitical and financial and institutional stakes in that? So the first version was really a reflection on the Anthropocene, and it took as its major text Lucretius's De Rerum Natura, which is going to be fairly short and poetic piece, but in a sense it begins with I want to frame that Lucretius is a major figure. The second reflection or talk that this occurred was on the emergence of speculative realism, and particularly the work of Quentin Meillassoux and the popularity of that work, which continues in a certain kind of return state. One of my work is on the notion of a certain underlying theme that collects different works like object-oriented ontology, speculative realism, the Anthropocene. All are framed by a certain methodological gesture, which I'll talk about here, that is of not even bracketing in a phenomenological sense, but in a sense, completely foreclosing the position of the subject as the beginning of philosophy, or trying to some extent. Meillassoux' gesture of after Finitude, which I'll talk about very briefly, was one of such gestures. So again, at one time I did a lecture using this text, building on the text that I'll read to you today, which asked the question, what does this gesture mean? And why is it unifying so many different kinds of projects, particularly projects that attempt to create from scratch a new metaphysics, a new metaphysical system? And they do so primarily by, I would say, foreclosing or basically jettisoning in a very strong sense the entire period of critical philosophy up to Kant. So in a sense, it is the Kantian moment, particularly the Kantian structure of philosophy, the faculties, the understanding, the system, the history of philosophy, that in a sense is some way that unites many gestures trying to get around the problem of the transcendental subject, as you know. So in Kant, which critical philosophy had been trying to deconstruct and never successfully deconstructed the position of the transcendental subject. So the solution was, okay, well, let's just get rid of it. Just begin philosophizing as if there was no Kant. And so the Meillassoux text is a second moment in this talk. And that's the moment concerning the Arca Fossil and his example of a form of basically the existence of a being, the Arca Fossil, the existence of something before humans existed. So the existence of something before any manifestation or givenness that defines the subject or human consciousness or time. The third goes back to my period of my own study where I worked very closely. There have been three major, I'd say, philosophical influences on my work. Jacques Derrida, who was my mentor and my advisor, is certainly a critical and returning ghost or phantom in my work today, particularly when it comes to questions of the political, or when it comes to questions of the philosophy of the philosophy of how to be, the fidelity to a certain method of philosophy that remains critical. Deleuze, whose work has been very inspiring to me around the question of concepts, which is something that I love to write about, concepts, method, genealogy of concepts. Foucault to some extent as well. But Lyotard is a bit of a secret filiation, I would say. I studied with Lyotard in my graduate career very early on. I didn't like him as a person, but oftentimes that can be the greatest teacher. That counter-transference in a psychoanalytic sense is very important in a sense of prompting you to resist and at the same time to identify and resist that identification. So Lyotard has been an underwriting interlocutor of my work. But I've kind of gone back to his writings from the mid-'80s or from even the '90s when I was working or studying with him, which in an uncanny way already predicted and was already engaged. If you think about the inhuman, the essays collected on the inhuman, on art, but also on materialism, on question of time and memory or time and matter, on cybernetics, on thermodynamics, on materialism in its modern and postmodern senses, already predicted many of the moves that I've been talking about under the notion of the Anthropocene, of new materialism, of speculative realism, but takes it up in a very different way, so I kind of went back to that. So the last part of this really takes up a moment or a gesture from one of his early essays when he begins to reflect on the end after finitude. After finitude would, in a cosmological and geological way, after the explosion of the sun, after the moment when the solar system to which Earth and the planets of this solar system belong will be extinct, which is about 4.5 billion years from now. So in a certain way, already Lyotard was thinking about this moment of a post-human, which could be, I'm going to equate that there's no difference in talking about a time before the human and a time after the human. So again, it's bracketing around this notion of Anthropocene. So I want you to think about those kind of associations, because this is more of a poetic text in a sense dedicated to Vera, in terms of the logic, in terms of the manner in which I develop an argument. It's more poetic and recursive rather than propositional. And in some ways it's dedicated to you as well. So, Vienna, November 1st, 2017. Recently, I've been rereading Lucretius's great poem, De Rerun Natura. At the same time, I've been reflecting on death. Of course, these two activities naturally go together, since Lucretius himself wrote the poem basically as an argument concerning why we should not fear death, as an argument, or rather, why the fear of death is the cause of the greatest amount of suffering and illusions in life, especially the illusion of God. This, according to Lucretius, fear of death is a projection of terrors experienced in life, of pain that only a living and intact mind can feel. Being completely devoid of sensation and thought, a dead person cannot miss being alive. Therefore, as a consoling gesture, Lucretius also put forward what he called the symmetry argument against the fear of death. In it he says, and this is addressed to Memmius in the beginning of the treatise or of the poem, he says, the people who fear the prospect of eternal non-existence after death should think back to the eternity of non-existence before their birth, which probably did not cause them much suffering. More recently, in my private reflections on the primordial time of the universe, it suddenly occurred to me that this may be one way of understanding what is partly a psychological motive for the problem of ancestrality put forward by Quentin Meillassoux in After Finitude. I remind you that it has been little more than 10 years ago that he first put us on the track to the Arca Fossil as what he called the hidden path that will lead to a temporality prior to consciousness and of life itself, in order, quote, to get rid of ourselves, unquote, which is to say, to get rid of the necessity of the subject entirely as the true cause of all of our suffering, a suffering that has grown to encompass the earth, if not the universe itself. So you can hear the Anthropocene. I thought to myself, might this not be a contemporary version of the Lucretian materialism that admonishes us to reflect on the eternity of non-existence before the advent of our species, or, as I will qualify this statement later on, prior to the emergence of the ego? Here, although Meillassoux may not disagree that the material universe he describes bears some implicit kinship with the Lucretian universe, the contemplation of which is in a certain sense was also fashioned as a manner of getting rid of ourselves, though in a much more poetical fashion than merely discoursing, quote, about a past in which both humanity and life are absent. Now keep that in mind. He makes an argument where he talks about the absence of the subject, but he's also talking about the absence of life itself, which is contradictory and problematic, and I'll bring that up. Certainly he would object to my subjectivist account for his own motive, that some way it was for him a way of getting rid of the fear of death. The fear of death, the absence of the ego. Moreover, in substituting the term ego for the term that Meillassoux employs, which is subject, the name for the position of a reflective or thetic conscious that is declared to be absent in the grasping of the ancestral realm, according to his argument, that I'm importing a foreign and moreover dangerously psychoanalytic term into the analytic, which threatens to spoil the purely objective illusion of the ancestral realm. Nevertheless, I think here, let me stop or pause to say, I think there's been a great deal of confusion lately between the concepts of the term subject and ego around the place of consciousness. Since psychoanalysis, in fact, has shown that it's precisely that the function of a subject occurs in the absence of the consciousness of the ego. So a parallel to Meillassoux' own, when you say that the consciousness is absent, you're actually saying that there is a subject, but in a sense does not require consciousness as a term or a function. And I'll explain how that works. From a rigorous psychoanalytic perspective, it is the reality of the symbolic order that includes also the order of machines that effectively reduces the necessity of consciousness, which is why consciousness is not altogether absent, but according to Lacan's famous formulation, decentered in relation to the world of all symbolic calculation, all abstraction. For example, as in the case of mathematical symbols or algebraic calculations, which is to say the order of machines that function without the need of anything like an empirical or individual consciousness as a condition for their operation. So algorithms can function without consciousness of an ego in order to play the role of the steering or the pilot to some degree. They function automatically, autopoetically, so this is all around the notion of, in a sense, what constitutes a subject. And if we think about the order of mathematics, the order of, in a sense, particularly how that is actualized in mechanics, then in a sense there is a certain subject, there is an efficient causality that sets in motion, in a sense, the function of machines. That is, there is a subject without necessarily being an ego. There is no consciousness in the machine necessarily. To illustrate this confusion, let me turn to a similar, if not identical, speculative fable that Lacan employed very early on, 1950, 1951, to demonstrate a similar claim that Meillassoux will make 50 years later with the example of the Arca Fossil, although he will draw very different conclusions concerning the significance of the phenomenon of consciousness itself. Quote, suppose all men have disappeared from the world. He begins, then immediately adds the following rejoinder, speaking mostly to the philosophers the analytic philosophers who are in attendance. I say men on the account of the high value which you attribute to consciousness, unquote. Moreover, let's take it to the point where all living beings have disappeared and there are only waterfalls and springs left, lightning and thunder too. It is at this point in the splendor of this post-Anthropocene world, as you might have suspected, Lacan posits the existence of an object mirrored in an ante-Silurian lake. Once again, so the extinction event that occurred before the Silurian epoch or period, in a sense, to imagine that we are back there again. But I'm putting it in the past rather than the future. Once again, we are dealing with a mirror. And you know from Lacan that the mirror plays an important role in his theoretical constructions of the imaginary and of the ego. And he asks, the image in the mirror, the image in the lake, do they still exist? Unquote. Of course they do, he immediately objects, since the rays that return to the mirror cause us to locate in a purely virtual space an object that supposedly exists in reality. However, the physics, in other words, the physics of reflection itself, the real object is not the object that you see in reality. So, quote, here we have the phenomenon of consciousness as such, the mirage, or the image of the mirror. Moreover, let us also recognize that the order of the mirror has evolved into an order of the machine at a high point of our civilization, so that we can imagine instruments sufficiently complicated enough to go on recording images in the lake, despite of the fact that all living beings have disappeared. So according to what Lacan calls a purely materialist definition, recalling explicitly the universe of Lucretius, this is also a phenomenon of consciousness as such, which won't have been perceived by any ego-like experience, given that, quote, any kind of ego or consciousness of the ego is absent at the time, unquote. Here you might immediately perceive the correspondence with Meillassoux' example of the Arca Fossil, if you're familiar. He posits the Arca Fossil as existing this strange entity or being that is already a fossil that may never have been alive, that suddenly he posits as an example of a being that existed before givenness, before humans. So he posits this as a major example. Given that humans don't exist, how can we even talk about the Arca Fossil? It's never been given. So this is a bit the paradox he tries to introduce. It's a bit simplistic, and I'll explain why. In fact, according to Meillassoux' speculative fable, the Arca Fossil functions exactly as an object in a mirror, since it contains or presents an image of a being in itself, an object in itself. But in this case, there is no subject, literally. It's a very literal thesis. There's no subject posited to apprehend the image. Consequently, the subject is absent, so therefore can it be an object anymore, blah, blah, blah. This is presented as the entire paradox from which he launches his speculative thesis or realist thesis. How can a being manifest being's anteriority to manifestation? Unquote. How can a being manifest being's anteriority to manifestation? So the paradox is, how can there be any being given prior to the givenness of being? In other words, Meillassoux asks, quote, how are we to think the meaning of a discourse which construes the relation to the world, that of thinking and or living, as a fact inscribed in temporality, within which this relation is just one event among others, inscribed in an order of succession, in which it is merely a stage rather than an origin? How is science able to think such statements, and in what sense can we eventually ascribe truth to them? How can science talk about pre-existent or pre-emergent events and beings? However, it occurs to me that before you can gain access to the ancestral realm as such, to the great outside that he calls it, you must find some way to cause the present world occupied by humans to disappear, which he accomplishes by appealing to the existence of real numbers on a line of quantitative duration, on the basis of which we can have little machines called thermonuclear clocks that function without the shadow of any ego-like experience in order to date the existence or to date objects that precede, that are interior. Thus, contemporary science is in a position to precisely determine, albeit in the form of a revisable empirical hypothesis, the dates of the formation of fossils of creatures living prior to the emergence of the first hominoids, the genre of life between different extinction events, the date of the accretion of the Earth, the date of the formation of the stars, and even, finally, the age of the universe itself. For example, the date of the origin of the universe is about 13.5 billion years. The date of the accretion of the Earth is about 4.5 billion years. The date of the origin of life is about 3.5 billion years ago. The date of the origin of humankind, Homo habilis, is about 2 million years ago. For what is at stake here, Meillassoux posits, is the nature of scientific discourse, and more particularly, what characterizes discourse, its mathematical form. Thus, we shall therefore maintain the following. All those aspects of the object that can be formulated in mathematical terms can be meaningfully conceived as properties of the object itself, in itself. Properties of the object in itself, without the need for any perception or any consciousness of any subject. At this point, let us return to the millennia of our epoch, of His Majesty the ego, called the Anthropocene, which many humanists have taken up as the critical perspective in order to decenter the anthropocentric presence of the subject in its opening to the material universe and the history of that presence. This decentering operation usually involves a supplanting of the subject by an absence, which usually assumes the form of a speculative thesis involving either time on a planetary scale or paleontological scale, or of another species, different scales of species, opening, animals, plants, and so forth, in order to decenter or in order to displace, in a sense, the anthropocentric perspective of the human. And of course, I'm referring to a series of many works, including Haraway and including Carrie Wolf, and who's a very close colleague and friend, and talking about that, or object-oriented ontology. Graham Harman talks about, in a sense, beginning with the object itself, or a notion of objects that have no need for a subject position. Perhaps even as a reflection of the above trend, we have also witnessed the emergence of a seemingly concerted effort to displace altogether or to radically bracket the phenomenological experience of the subject as as one of the origins of philosophical representation. You don't begin with consciousness, you don't begin with the consciousness of the subject, you don't begin with the position of experience, of an opening to experience. In a sense, you seek to, in a sense, begin immediately on the side of the object. As if the existence of the subject itself constituted, for many philosophers today, the final form of error in contemporary philosophy. We're trying to get rid of an error that has plagued philosophy since Descartes, I would say, and up through Kant. And wants to place, and again, the subject under erasure in formulating a new concept of truth or representation itself. In my view, however, it is the form of error that constitutes the most common element of signification that appears behind all of the different analytical positions that have been recently gathered together under the general thematics of speculative realism, object-oriented ontology, Anthropocene, extinction studies, so many of these, animal studies, others. They share one methodological gesture as the ground or the foundation of their system. And this image comes from Bergson. It's a very beautiful image. Bergson talked about how in any given epoch of philosophy, and you remember Bergson was a great critic of metaphysics, he said, there are all these different polemics, and as we see today, all these different arguments that occur, which always take the form of pointing out an error in the previous tradition of philosophy. Okay? He said, but underlying all of these different errors that occur on the surface of like a sea, a turbulent sea, the underlying unity of all the polemics is a great form of error that unifies them all. So the subject is the great error that defines contemporary philosophy today. And if you do philosophy today, you have to correct the error in some way. You have to address the error. Okay? Thus, the absence is no longer determined in correlation to either consciousness of, as in phenomenology, but rather in terms of either the not yet or no longer of a subject. The question that would concern us here, what, or rather where is time in all of this? Or more specifically, whether the theme of time or temporality could even be possible, including what Meillassoux claims as, quote, a deeper level of temporality with which what came before the relation to the world is itself but a modality of the relation to the world. Okay, so I don't, we'll go back to that. Okay, a deeper, but this is an important, because first of all, he invokes that there is a deeper, this notion of deeper, more profound, underlying level of temporality that came before the relation to the world and is itself just simply a modality of the relation to the world. So we can return to that in the question, because I'm not sure it's completely clear. But what is this deeper temporality? Under what givenness, to use Meillassoux' term, does it reside? And why deeper? Does this not mean more significant or eventful, meaningful? But for whom, if not for the subject of the statement? And that is to say, the subject of the statement of speculative realism, for whom the pure facticity of the arca fossil is singular, quote, singular, eventful, and later on, critically potent, unquote. Within the temporality of the statement itself, moreover, the subject of speculative realism, for whom the object of the arca fossil is manifested as an event, there is a strict correlation drawn between subject and object, both of which are contemporaneous or present in the statement, in the temporality of the statement. But the temporality of this correlation does not refer to the past for all of its ancestral significance, which is simply before, but rather to the present that is manifested as the statement's own singular, eventful, and critical potency in the contemporary time of philosophy. So this is a great gesture, in other words. Returning to Meillassoux' description, although ancestrality is a temporal notion, quote, its definition does not invoke distance in time, but rather anteriority in time. This is why the arca fossil does not merely refer to the unwitnessed occurrence, but to what he calls a non-given occurrence. Ancestral reality does not refer to occurrences which a lacunary givenness cannot apprehend. The inverse side of a cube, for example. So in as architects would probably go crazy. You know, you work with lacunary givenness, because in a sense, you have to use geometry in order to draw in the field of an object. You have to create an object from, in a sense, one side or one partial surface. In a sense, you have to construct through geometry. So this is not allowed. This is lacunary givenness, in which what is hidden or what is behind is already given. So this is, in a sense, non-givenness, okay? Pure non-givenness, okay? But to the occurrences that are not contemporaneous with any givenness, whether lacunary or not, I'm continuing to read Meillassoux, thus negating any extrapolation, abstraction, or geometrical calculation in the construction of the object, either in general or in itself. In the construction of any exterior object, you know. So. And at one point in the argument, Meillassoux even strips the arca fossil. This is really kind of funny. The arca fossil, I mean, this is what philosophers laugh about sometimes. He strips, for some reason, and it's an analytic argument, he strips the arca fossil of even a relation to extension. So it has only temporal, which if there are any real analytic philosophers in the room, we can say, is this possible in a sense to say that a thing can exist only temporally without any extension or extensio? I mean, so that'd be an interesting question. It is, in a sense, the purely punctiform event of a date as a fact, that is, of a number. So numbers could be said to exist without, but that's not true, without extension. You have to have more than one number, and then it's 3, and that sort of thing. So this is very confusing. Therefore, the upside of the definition of ancestrality, which refers to the non-contemporaneous events that occur in time that are present by the degree of intensity or potency, to take the argument of primary and secondary qualities, which he begins his whole argument with, is this potency felt by the object itself? Let us say this eventness. Does the Arca Fossil contain this quality of potency of the expression of a primary quality? No, poor Arca Fossil. Since it's been stripped a priori of all secondary qualities, those that would arrive precipitously in relation to us. So, color, sound, sense, any body, any extension. Thus, the Arca Fossil has neither any relation to a living present, as a phenomenologist like to say after Husserl, nor even an ancestral present. Therefore, no relation to world, and thus no form of self-affection. That is, no symbol of its own making. And the inability to create any symbolic understanding or extension of itself, since it is only composed of primary qualities, that is, to quote Meillassoux, all those aspects of the object that can give rise to a mathematical thought, to a formula, or to digitalization, rather than to a perception or sensation, and thus can be meaningfully turned into properties of the thing, not only as it is for me, but also as it is without me. I'm going to leave Meillassoux pretty soon, so just I wanted to kind of like go over this turn here for you to really get a sense of what the argument is and how it's constructed. At this point, we could turn to examine the status of Arca Fossil and Meillassoux in the context of Heidegger's famous claim that the stone is without world, weltlos. But I would prefer to turn again to Lacan from the same seminar that I quoted before as on a question that is very close to what I'm driving at here today. The question concerning why planets don't speak. Here's the passage from the introduction to the book. You can see it. This is my style. A little funny sometimes. Let me read this passage to you, which is one of my favorites in Lacan. As you know, Lacan, you can read, it's all funny, you don't understand anything he's saying, you think in the end, he didn't really say anything. But this, in this text, I think he does say something that's really profound. Why don't planets speak? That's the real question. You only know what can happen to a reality once you have definitely reduced it to all being inscribed in a language, including mathematical or an alphabetic language or a script or any kind of language. We only became absolutely certain that planets do not speak once they've been shut up. That's to say, once Newtonian theory had produced a theory of the unified field in a form that has since been completed, a form which was already entirely satisfactory for every thinker. The theory of the unified field is summed up by the law of gravitation, which consists essentially in the fact that there's a formula which holds all of this together in an ultra-simple language consisting of 3 letters. At the time, thinkers came up with all kinds of objections. This gravitation is unthinkable. We've never seen the like of this action at a distance, across a void. Every kind of action is by definition an action of things in contact with one another, etc., etc. If you knew how hard Newtonian motion is to get a hold of when examined up close, you would realize that operating with contradictory notions isn't the exclusive privilege of psychoanalysis. Newtonian motion makes use of time, but no one worries about the time of physics because it doesn't in the slightest touch on realities. Now, this is a very interesting statement. It is a question of proper language, a formal axiomatic language in physics. If you change the language, you change reality. The unified field cannot be considered as anything more than a well-made language, a syntax. Unquote. It's a beautiful quote. So it would be. Okay, so getting back, now I'll go to my third. As we know, the planets today, but particularly the stars, are less silent than they were in the 18th century. They, in fact, are quite noisy. But does this mean that they can speak? And what would they say if they could tell us what they are thinking? But for this to happen, we would have to imagine something like a cosmic intersubjectivity, something like Stanislav Lem's Solaris, and would need to introduce into them something like a mouth to speak with, even if it's purely a mental mouth, that the planets came to speak to us in our dreams, for example. But in order for them to say anything, and I follow Lacan's quote intentionally here, we would need to imagine the planets are lacking, and for this reason, they need to speak to us, and above all, not to be misunderstood. They would need an imago, something that Meillassoux, in the manner of Newton, doesn't want to give them at all, wants to strip them of any relation to the imago. But before moving on, I want to return one moment to Lucretius and his description of the initial void. Assuming that Meillassoux' speculation of the ancestral world has some relation to the subjective scenario of the symmetry argument that I began with, as a contemplation of the universe before the declension of finitude or turbulence in Serre, as a constellation and cure in a phenomenological sense of a strictly human correlationism, death and finitude, then Lucretius' description of atoms falling through a void prior to any Klineman would offer the same kind of potency or critical potency at his time, even though it is not modern in the sense that Meillassoux wants it to be empirically verifiable by mathematical measurement, unless we identify the atoms as primordial according to modern science. So because the age of the Earth is approximately 4.6 billion years, this means that the half-life of given nuclides must be greater than about 100 million years, according to this science, for practical considerations. For example, for a nuclide with a half-life of 60 million years, this means 77 half-lives have elapsed, meaning that for each mole, or a certain grouping of atoms, that nuclide being present at the formation of the Earth, only 4 atoms actually exist today. So it's a very beautiful image, but also an image that begins to think about a finitude in a very material and different sense. Again, I return to my question. Where is time in this formulation? One could say that it exists only in a nuclear atomic decay, and assuming there's a constant rate of decay, which there's not under quantum theory, it can be measurable as one duration of matter. But in this material plane, there would be neither past nor future, because these are only introduced from the perspective of a present or an event that appears on this plane of matter and energy. For example, the Arca Fossil, or an image on a Silurian lake, will occur within a duration of the material universe. But they also occur in distinct or separate ages of the world, discrete events that happen between geological epochs, or extinction events. 2 events that occurred killed 20% of all families, 50% of all genera, and 60 to 70% of all species in the Silurian period. Together, they are ranked by many scientists as the second largest of the 5 major extinctions in Earth's history. At this point, I abruptly break off my interrogation of Meillassoux' description of the ancestral past demonstrated in the facticity of the Arca Fossil. Now, in conclusion, I'll turn to Lyotard, who in the mid-1980s, in a series of reflections on the inhuman, speculated on the absence that will actually occur 4.5 billion years in the future, when the sun has exploded and the Earth and all of its inhabitants no longer exist. This is not a speculative gesture. It bears the same sense of facticity that Meillassoux wants to claim for the Arca Fossil prior. But rather, the duration of the Earth itself or the solar system can be datable, to be extinct, or to, in a sense, come to a point of extinction at a certain point. That's not a question, he writes. While we talk, Lyotard says, the sun is getting older. It will explode in 4.5 billion years. It's just a little beyond this expected lifetime. Here to summarize the argument, one can already see the makings of what Meillassoux would define as a strong correlationism, which poses thought and being in an absolute opposition, that is, around a limit that is posed by this assertion of facticity. That the sun will explode is posed as a fact, and Lyotard writes, after the sun's death, there won't be a thought to know that its death took place. In other words, here's the limit or finitude that defines and orients thought has changed scale and no longer concerns human finitude exclusively. The finitude of the sun in our solar system does not concern the death of man or the Anthropocene. In 4.5 billion years, there will arrive the demise, Lyotard says, of your phenomenology and of your utopian politics, and there will be no one there to toll the death knell or hear it. Unquote. Lyotard was very pessimistic towards the end before he died. And yet Lyotard posits the identity of thought and the human and binds that human to an earthly existence. So our species is also bound to this absolute limit from which thought, we call science, borrows horizon and orientation against the infinity of matter that only knows endless change, infinite change. In other words, we wouldn't even think to consider this limit, that is, to incorporate it into our thought as a factical horizon, if our species was not already fundamentally bound to it from the beginning, if the sun's death did not also concern our material and bodily existence, that is, our corporal bodies, which constitute the sources of our own specific finitude that we share with other terrestrial life forms in common. But here, turning perhaps to what is Lyotard in conclusion, to Lyotard's most striking and original thesis. It is precisely this limit that we seek to negate by extending the possibilities of the human beyond our corporeal and earthly existence in order to, in the end, survive the death of the sun. This requires thought that no longer needs a body, that no longer is bound to that limit, a form of thought in which energy is converted into information and reconverted into new matter. In other words, according to Lyotard, we are in the process, a long process of leaving our bodies behind us, which requires, first of all, that our bodies become more accessible by knowledge and technology in order to be able to leave the earth one day. And this reminds me of a line from Burroughs, what are we here for? To go. As Lyotard writes, this process of increasing complexity that defines modern societies also involves converting the former limits of knowledge and information and the subject who is capable of processing information with a greater degree of complexity, which has been going on for some time and has been addressed by many cybernetic and post-humanist theories. According this, and this alone is what is at stake today in technical and scientific research in many fields, from dietetics, neurophysiology, genetics, and tissue synthesis, bioplasticity, to particle physics, astrophysics, cybernetics, information science, nuclear physics, and architecture. Therefore, quote, the human race is already in the grip of the necessity of having to evacuate the solar system in 4.5 billion years. It, the Earth, the body, will have been the transitory vehicle for an extremely improbable process of evolution. The exodus is already on the agenda. The only chance of success lies in the species adapting itself to the complexity that challenges it. And if the exodus succeeds, what will have been preserved is not the species itself, but, quote, the most complete monad with which the species was pregnant. It's a beautiful image from the Leibnizian notion of them. Is the most absolute knowledge we will carry with us into the solar system, not our bodies, not the species, not the memory of the species, but only the sum total of God, the monad, the central monad that we create, in our species created. Here I return to the question of why we are in the process of erasing the former limit, the so-called, so now you can see I recursively come back to partly fold these reflections back on why do many of these new theories want to bracket or exclude the subject as a beginning point, the embrace of greater complexity, and complex systems theories, and so forth. This is, in a sense, something that Lyotard was trying to address in terms of the theory of, in a sense, that we are preparing ourselves for transplanetary and solar travel someday. But meaning through changing the genome of our species itself, changing the knowledge and the complexity, and therefore changing consciousness, or the material basis of consciousness, no longer dependent upon the body and on gender and on race and so forth. But the question becomes, why is this erasure of the limit that also involves our bodies and our very openness to the event of time and temporality, to the unknown event itself, is negated in favor of becoming knowledge that is information that can be easily recalled or reproduced to effectively control time and avoid the event fundamentally. And this goes to Leibniz, the idea that there is no death or finitude when, in a sense, there will be no future when we have enough knowledge to actually control every event as information that can be manipulated, and therefore we can avoid every accident that can occur. There will be no arbitrariness or contingency or accident of time. We will have complete control. Okay, so a bit of a fantasy, but I'm not so sure. I think that we could realize it if we really put our mind to it. Which in the beginning of my presentation I simply called death. But why is this posed in terms of a liberation of the subject for something else, or in favor of something else that is inhuman? Is this because, according to Lyotard, the human race is now in a process of found a need to dehumanize itself, in the sense that it is still too much of a biopolitical species in order to rise to a new level of complexity, quote, so as to become a telegraphic species? Here an ethical question emerges that also constitutes a temporal problem of finality, the demand for greater complexity, since this reason is nowhere present in time. The demand for greater complexity, there's no reason for the reason of complexity. If you begin to interrogate the need for complexity, the demand for more complex societies, it is already tautological. It's because societies are more complex that we need a more complex thought to deal with the complexity that we create. So it's a completely recursive loop, which is not grounded in any reason. There's no sufficient reason for complexity. Either in time of calculation or in the time of knowledge. So I'll end with this one quote from Lyotard, which could be an opening to some discussion. When you can stimulate or simulate in vitro the explosion of the sun, or the fertilization of the gestation of a living creature, you have to decide what you want. And we just don't know. This foreclosure of ends is there in the principle of scanning, what Lyotard refers to elsewhere as the central monad, the process of projecting, already knowing the givingness of something. It has been dressed up in all sorts of disguises: the destination of man, progress, enlightenment, emancipation, happiness. Today, this foreclosure appears naked. More knowledge and power? Yes. But why? No. Thank you.
Yeah, maybe I can start. I have, of course, a lot of questions. The main one, I guess, which I'm always, I think it has, so what I'm amazed by is that those new philosophies that you address, speculative realism and so on, especially Quentin Meillassoux and then object-oriented, which I think you nicely described this interest to bracket, but not only to bracket, actually to cancel out the subject, no? But then...
in the sense of aufgehoben. But it's not even the sense of aufgehoben, because they don't even want to preserve the subject in any way. It is a jettisoning. That's why it's different from bracketing or from canceling out. Yeah. But
then these, so that, because that's a strange twist which is happening. The object in philosophy is that which allows us to address finitude, to be non-absolute. No? So the object is that which allows for reasoning. But then these philosophies which foreground the object so much, they are all postulating new absolutes. So that's the one thing. But then the other thing, the philosophies that try to counter this by emphasizing the positions of the subject, they do the same thing. Now, like your argument with Lyotard, so okay, it's not the arche fossil, which is ultimately at the beginning, but it's now at the end of life in this galaxy, to which the Earth forms a part. So it's in the same gesture. So to invoke a notion of the absolute, on the basis of which it is then argued that this kind of oscillation between subject and object, as the two, perhaps we could call them conditions for reasonability, that they can be legitimated, either one or the other.
Yeah.
So, and what is now, my interest is so much in the notion of chance today.
Yeah.
The chance is involved on both sides, you could say, but it's something radically different. So chance an inclusive notion of language in terms of regarding everything, mathematics, codes, all the different science symbols in terms of a language, of a language of the pure soul in the Lacanian. So I wouldn't put it that way, of course, but it comes to this, no? A language that is pre-individual, pre-specific, and so on. And on the other hand, this very form of thinking that allows us to date scientific objects as we are, like the beginning of yeah. So now we have a number for when the universe apparently started. We have a number for how many years yeah, the Earth is supposedly already there, and so on. So what allows these kinds of dating, they all involve probabilistic. So it's not something which can be placed within a continuum of real numbers. That would be something like the omnipresence without passing of some contemporariness. So how to address, or what can chance do in such constellations? What do you think about this? How do you see this?
Well, I mean, there are different parts of this. I mean, I bet to address the last one first, that's the question of where is time within that calculation. If we posit, yes, it's an order of probability, and of course, in the scientific theory, it's based on a probabilistic calculation that is, in a sense, constantly revisable according to the improvements of technology and of new evidence that appears through radio telescopes and so forth. But it is the best language. It is the language that we can use to create a unified field theory for the universe. Even though this is being challenged on a level of quantum, because in a sense that even the Einsteinian theory is not based upon the idea that there is a constant that can be measurable. So the interesting thing about that is that it can't account for contingencies or events that occur within that duration. And one of the contingencies is that the introduction of a present or any moment within a duration is a contingency. It's a radical contingency because in a sense it splits or multiplies time from that present onward. And so there cannot be just in a sense one duration then. If we even think about, for instance, that there be a constant rate, the basis for the measurement is that there is a rate of nuclear decay or nucleoid decay in the atom. Then in a sense that they've been able to trace or speculate the thesis that there are atoms that existed before, sometime before the origin of the universe, and the rate of decay is what time is. But this has nothing to do with a philosophical notion of time. And it's very interesting that within this, but what Meillassoux is I think that that's more profound and more interesting. The notion of that a gravitational or of decay, a gravitational decay, or a decay within the atom is a way of registering, in a sense, of defining time would be an interesting philosophical concept to explore. Meillassoux is using a very simplistic chronological dating system and saying that that's just, in a sense, it's real. It's like real. He keeps on coming back to a Pythagorean moment, that these are just real numbers that exist in matter, and that basically we can, in a sense, refer to them with certainty or truth, but we have to subject them to some modern empirical verification. But the universe is made of real numbers, basically.
Which is kind of silly to say today, no?
It is. But it's not silly to say, according to the terms of this gesture, of getting rid of a notion of temporality or consciousness of temporality that begins with the notion of a subject that time is internal to consciousness, internal time consciousness, and therefore that makes the human correlation between the self-affection of exterior and interior in the subject is, in a sense, is the very declension of time. So the subject would be, in a sense, like in Lucretius, it would be that moment when time turned inward to itself and, in a sense, began at that moment. Yeah.
But maybe so
Mhm.
with which he accommodated. And it didn't influence the objectivity and the scientificness of what is based on it, but it is an absolute of which he said, so it's an absolute and it's a postulated one. This is one which cannot be comprehended within the kind of science that I'm setting up. And very similar with Lucretius. No, it's a poem. It's
Yeah.
not an argument.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's a poem. But these texts by Meillassoux, for example, or also by Barnes is polemic, okay? But with Meillassoux, it's very carefully crafted. But what is the voice that is speaking? So it's not choosing a format that could somehow frame this absolutism which it postulates. It's self-referential in an unreflected way. So
Yeah. Yeah.
So
And it.
do you see anything like through chance or through what would be this? So what would be this theological, not the substitute for the theological link of this kind of absolute in these philosophies?
Well, okay. So the parallel here is like the passage from Lacan is what I was trying to use. The passage from Lacan. It's a very beautiful passage. Is that at a certain point Newtonian physics silenced all planets. Remember, the planets were gods and deities, and you know, in a sense, they spoke to people, and their position in the sky could be random. You know, we could tell the future by the planets and so forth like that. Newton did away with all that. In a sense, the planets follow laws, the laws of gravitation, and in doing so, they were silenced. In a sense, they had nothing more to say. And it's a beautiful image, I think, of what's happening in Meillassoux also is to silence, in a sense, any contingencies with a purely positive or formalistic language or discourse that, in a sense, like a positivism, seeks to reduce all problems to a very narrow selection of problems. So the problem of the thing in itself, the problem of the object, the problem is there are objects not in the Berkeleyan way, or not in a simplistic empiricism, not objects that are there when we don't perceive them. He's saying that's not what I'm talking about. The objects in themselves exist without any, outside any givenness that encompasses, in a sense, any kind of reference to the subject. And now, ladies and gentlemen, I'm giving you a philosophy where you can posit the existence of those objects in themselves, which, in the beginning of Kant said objects in themselves cannot be, he outlawed that as a gesture, right? Which is shaped and determined in critical philosophy and the limits of representation upon the finitude of sensibility and the relation of the subject's sensibility, or the conditions of sensibility to representation in general, for a very critical, let's say, anti-theological reason at one point, against the notion of a God in itself. So now, in a sense, no, there are objects in themselves, and now I've developed a system in which you can begin to posit the reality of those objects without any need for reference to the subject or to temporality defined previously like that. So in a sense, and this is a common gesture also. I'm being critical, but I'm more interested in why. Why is the gesture so radical at this moment? What is it performing? And I think that you raised that question very well, because in the Newtonian gesture of submitting all planetary motion to laws of gravitation, the discovery of gravitation, in a sense that all planets obey the same laws, all objects obey the same laws, everyone obeys. There's a universalism to that new discovery that has a theological purpose, is to get rid of Catholicism, to get rid of, to some degree, to get rid of any particularism that would in a sense interfere with that new understanding of the scientific truth. Yeah. So that's partly, in a sense, part of that gesture.
Connecting to Newton and this notion of the Earth is just a ball of mud in the void of the universe, is this not one of the reasons for the freedom of consciousness, what you have if you eliminate the individual? You have the consciousness itself is eliminated in the
Yeah.
Or in the other sense, what you mentioned before, if you have this image of the world filled with planets which are gods, you get another, totally another picture of the world. You get more this kind of Gaia thinking, like the planet is has
Yeah.
consciousness itself, and she is dividing the consciousness into individuals. This would be much more livingly philosophy, which would
Yeah.
help us to survive in this planet. Whereas you have all these guys in France who are planning the exodus and see the best solution in falling into the sun in 4.5 million years.
Well, and this is not, that's not a speculative thesis, because if you follow, in a sense, the tradition of actual post-humanist thinking, from cybernetic thinking from the 50s onward, from Wiener onward, then, in a sense, consciousness is precisely the problem they're seeking to reduce to a point that it can be reproducible as information.
Yeah, this is the other thing. What I would say is this problem of this male phenomenology thinking.
I'm with you.
You have to
Yeah.
produce
Yeah.
it technologically, or you have to eliminate it totally, and
Yeah.
that's where we are now. Yeah.
It's very interesting, and I think you would appreciate if you go back to that essay by Lyotard called, it's one of the first, it's in the volume, The Inhuman. Yeah. Yeah. So he precisely posits gender difference as, in a sense, that which can never be reduced to an algorithm or formula and so forth. It is going to pose the greatest obstacle to the desire to liberate consciousness from a body, to liberate, and basically to turn consciousness into a recursive information system. And so it's basically, it says there's something about the materiality of body, or particularly of gender, which is also the interference or the nexus of language and the body that in a sense will prevent that. And so at one way you could think, okay, well, this is like 80s French, kind of, feminine écriture or something like that. No, but I think he means it in the sense that it continues to pose the greatest problem to precisely those theorists, including the hard-wired theorists, the engineers themselves, that they either have to reduce it entirely, in other words, eradicate the question of gender, and that begins with Turing, okay? The question of gender emerges in his first experiment, as an anomaly that he has to, in a sense, reduce in terms of how can you tell if a computer, that you're having a dialogue, how can you tell if the conversant on the other side is a computer or a human? But in a sense, one of the examples, one of the experiments was how you can tell if the conversant is male or female. So that's just one sidebar to this. But it's interesting that, in a sense, that whatever that constitutes, and that's why I use the psychoanalysis too, whatever constitutes gender, which is unconscious to some degree, is in a sense a real problem to that.
Yeah, to put it into unconsciousness is one of the major problems, I think, because then you eliminate the source of this problem. You have to go back at least 100,000 years and see the last 5,000 years with
Yeah.
the male sky god and what was before the connection with the earth.
Yeah.
Which was
Well, that's a materialism that, as you were talking about with Gaia,
yes.
and those philosophies which have a basis in many, many different cultures, but the male and female principles, of many systems. I remember in Lucretius also, if you remember, there are two names for nature. One is Mars, sive natura, Mars, and one is Venus. So the De Naturalium is a poem to Venus, to a positive or affirmative nature. it's not the reduction of gender or to that, but that's in a sense also that these planets had been identified by different male and female. Mars is what he defines as domination, but the principle of domination that governs nature, a certain nature of violence and a certain nature of societies. And Venus is turbulence. It's a way of, in a sense, taking, or has a relation to a different curvature or a different way that the plane is curved, so.
I would like to defend the French thinkers a little bit, because there is one who is very different.
Yeah.
I'm very much
I like
Michel
very much.
Serre.
And
And just to pick up this argument, because it's precisely in the reading of Lucretius and of this question of gender and sex. So he translates Venus as Aphrodite, which is very important, because Aphrodite is a distributed body which collects here and there out of a distribution. So it's not a homogeneous and a unified and organized body, it's a distributed one which can organize in many ways. So it's Aphrodite is literally die Schaumgeboren. And then there's also a genealogy to it which is very interesting, because she is conceived after, so Zeus is the father, and his genitals were thrown into the sea.
Yeah.
So the potency of the male principle is decoupled from a body and thrown into the contingency of the sea, where the distributed potentia of this goddess of love, which is the goddess of love, is mixed. No? And in the reading that Serre gives to this, the sea exactly, this is the objectivity of chance.
And this is very interesting, because in the original mythology, she is the nature goddess, which is connected to the earth itself. And this phallus story is a male invention to discard her power. And maybe he sees it.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure there are many stories of it. What I like about this one is that it abstracts from the dialectics. No?
Yeah.
Either first women and then men, or first men and then women. So
Yeah.
there are many. I think it's much more productive to think a mixture in new ways. But yes, I'm sure there are many stories. But this is in Serre, this is important, and then also, and that is also very different from this Newtonian or this classic physical readings of a materialism. No, but you have, so it's not that energy is transformed into information.
Right.
So that's a problematical, that is already presupposing so much which is completely speculative.
Right.
No? So the idea whether when we have information as mathematical units, because they're not number, no, they're different from numbers. So information, the order system is a different one. Can we think of a process that doesn't use any energy in being machinically computed? So this is Maxwell's demon. So this is thought experiment from Maxwell in the 19th century, and there have been many versions of resolving this thought experiment. And the one version which I am completely fine with is one again by Michel Serre, saying, well, if so, it doesn't discuss whether it is realizable or not in a hypothetical manner. He is bringing it down to a practical manner, saying what we have is a relation between entropies. No, so systems are communicating, so homogenizing. So we have different entropies. But what we need in order to describe, and what also a machine needs in order to describe this, is negative entropy in order to describe what is going on. And now the conversion of it's like a positive and a negative entropy and positive entropy. And information is only there in negative entropy. In positive entropy, it's exactly there. It's not there. It's chaotic. It's white noise. So there is no information. So in order to have information, which would be this kind of disembodied agency, intellectual agency, you would have to have negative entropy. But now all of information theory in a physical mathematical term can only have a concept of negative entropy at the cost of entropy. So you create negative entropy by consuming, by using up entropy, so indeterminateness. So even if, or the argument then comes to say, if it were possible to have an agency which is completely negentropic, it would have to use up an infinity of entropy first to be this very agency, if it were discovered. So it's an absurdity.
Yeah.
So the problem is not that we have the right or the wrong assumptions to it. It's a realist failure of the very thought experiment. It's very beautiful reading, and it's introduced by the quantum physicist, importantly,
Right.
quantum physicist Lambert, who wrote the book Information Theory, and introduced this notion of the price of information. So we don't. So we only, when we learn something, we acquire information, and it's always at the price on the level of energy. But this is a complicated argument, and I'm not solid enough to make it here. But that's very interesting to look at.
Well, I mean, to go back though to the first two questions, the first question you asked, Vera, is there is what I perceive, and I've been writing about for a period of time, is a certain, well, I wouldn't want to call it crisis or turning, but an exhaustion of fundamental gestures in philosophy that have been dominant. On one side, you have a very critical tradition that's extended and even exacerbated the Kantian critical philosophy, the critique of the subject, which has produced, on one side, all of the different critical subjectivities that emerge as anti-humanist or critical of, like, the post-colonial feminists, all of the different bracketing, let's say, of the humanist, of the traditional humanist, of the Renaissance subject, in a sense, that find the energy of philosophy in the critique of the subject in order to create new identities, but also identities that are marginalized or peripheral to that subjectivity. So it's a project of I call it deconstruction, but it could be phrased, you could gather together many different philosophical positions and statements and major gestures under that gesture of the critique of the subject, but there was, it seemed to always reach an impasse around the notion of the subject itself. It seemed to always bring back the very centrality of the subject it sought to, in a sense, place in question and negate. I see now on the horizon, or within these new, I say more analytically influenced or styled philosophies, an attempt to create a new metaphysical philosophy simply by jettisoning the history of philosophy, of modern critical philosophy, and beginning again, usually either on the side of the object, thinking, but for the same reason, thinking that, in a sense, the entire problem of the history of philosophy is it is contaminated by the error of anthropocentric and humanist traditions of thinking, and therefore to liberate the object in itself, to liberate, in a sense, the thing, is the way, in a sense, to also set off on a new path to create a reality, or a philosophical reality. So I find it in this gap, in this space, or this abyss of these two chances, I find it a very interesting moment of what constitutes philosophy today, because we have reached the end of that language game, the end of that genre to some extent. And it needs to be not necessarily reinvented, but it needs to be imbued with a new expression. That's why I use Lucretius as one example, new poetic, perhaps, form of creation that in a sense that doesn't draw upon either the negativity or the negentropy of that problem of the subject, or that tradition, or in a very positivistic way doesn't seek to reduce the entire problem of philosophy to one side of the equation. Yeah.
And I have one more aspect which I found so as you described, a lot of these arguments, that believe that the position of the subject is somehow not problematical to their approach, because there are algorithms that operate automatically.
Yeah.
And it's so if there is so there is, of course, an interesting problem with how to think what formalism is. But in any case, what algorithms always need is a kind of a collective memory. So it can be an impersonal, an apersonal, an anonymous kind of memory, but algorithms work upon structured data. So
Yeah.
an algorithm can do nothing if there is no kind of order on which the data is organized. So that's maybe an interesting way to challenge these arguments that go by cognition and by consciousness so much, to attend to the same problems through the hypothesis or the speculation that there are forms of memory and of remembering that somehow can co-accommodate a certain kind of objectivity and a certain kind of subjectivity, which is no longer that of the individual person. So they're somehow collective, and through that link up with the forms, of course, of oral history, of traditions, and so on, that then can be dealt with politically in a very different way.
Yeah.
So I'm very interested in that. And this is again something that Michel Serres is working out.
Yeah, very much so.
The only one I know today.
Yeah. Well, it's the role of formalism and the formalism of logic within the tradition of philosophy on one side, that Serres is critiquing that move of positivism that has dominated both science, the science of axiomatics, and as well as the formalism of a certain kind of logical philosophy and epistemology. And on the other side, though, I mean, what you're speaking about, I was very interested, or I return sometimes to psychoanalysis and to Lacan. In the 1950s, Lacan was actually derived his notion of what constitutes a language more from cybernetic theory than he did from semiotics. You know, we've learned the wrong Lacan in a certain way by depending upon Saussure, or, you know, Saussure in a sense was used as an example of a cybernetic system, a simple cybernetic system that we call language. But it's precisely that symbolic that is the algorithm. That languages are symbolic, and that a lot of the critical philosophies are to critique the languages that are depersonalized or impersonal, that culture remembers what constitutes gender, what constitutes a subject, or what constitutes this, and then basically it's the critique of those codes, or the belief that we can recode that language at a level, and that is the work of the critical theory that has been, that develops another tradition of that kind of formalism, critical formalism, that's very interesting too. But then deriving this new, the idea that you can create a formal language that simply reduces problems to a specific region, like the problem of philosophy, to a specific region of, in a sense, the object in itself, is in a sense isolating a language, trying to create a very minimal language that is formal and in a sense excludes all of reality outside that language. And that's how many languages operate too. Languages can only, in a sense, they can incorporate, they don't include everything. They're very selective. And that's what formalization, in a sense, does. It can be selective in terms of what it includes, but it's also selective in terms of it excludes, it always excludes the whole or the all that constitutes its set. So it's a very interesting way of thinking about how languages emerge at a certain moment to do a specific role of narrowing the problem and excluding all of the things like gender and, you know, and the politics and so forth at a certain moment. And that's one of my interests as to why this, I'd say, a very scholastic form of philosophy has emerged, a pre-modern form of philosophy has emerged again at this particular moment politically, in a sense that all circulate around the creation of an ontology. When you create an ontology, the first term of any ontology in scholasticism is God. God is the first principle of philosophy. And so if you place the object in place of God,
well, then you have
it's the thing, you have a new God, you have the thing in itself. Yeah.
And that's the strange thing that they all want to do ontologies, but you can only derive an ontology from a metaphysics, and the metaphysics postulates first principles, and you can never reason the first principles.
Yeah.
And they skip this relation, all these ontologies. But I think it's, and that's why I think it really is an important question outside of love or philosophical speculation, because ontology has become this pragmatical thing with the computers. So there are semantic ontologies, there are expert systems that are based on ontology. So ontology and fabricated in order to stabilize communities of expertise today. And therefore ontologies, in exactly this sense, that the first principles on which those ontologies are accumulated and organized, they are bracketed out. So that is a new form. I very much agree of scholastic dogmatism. That is emerging.
If you think about the history of ontology, of the term or the mode of ontology as a method within the history of Western philosophy, ontology, in a sense, achieved its form. Well, it was earlier on posed as simply a branch or a region of metaphysics, and not the entire region. It is auxiliary, as you said. Now it doesn't occur on the basis of metaphysics anymore, or a complete metaphysical system, because we've given up the idea that we can create a complete metaphysical system.
Yes, they do absolutism.
Yeah. So in a sense, but specific ontologies concern the science of being, which is theology. Theology in its most perfect form, Aquinas, and gave the formal understanding of how to do ontology. And then, of course, we have in the modern ontologists, the revision of that by Heidegger and others. But in a sense, it always returns back to, in a sense, that first scientific of a theological science. But if you think about how ontologies are used today, if you think about, for instance, in animal studies or in ethical studies, we are always posing the problem of ontologies, the science of being, the totality of beings, in which there are flat ontologies. Well, how do you then care about one being over another being? So you have to posit the totality of beings and then rank those orders of beings in order to present the problem of, in a sense, the selective way that human beings treat certain beings better than others. So we do think in ontologies, and because it is part of a certain way that we organize the totality of things according to a region of being. Yeah.
But only in formal sciences. So in normal life we do this with words. And no one would claim that the language and the vocabulary in which we express our world in which we live would somehow be comprehensive or exhaustive and formally consistent. No, we live with this language.
Yeah.
And in our way that we use language, we can let things be indefinite to a certain amount, because it can be definite enough to get along with communicating. So there's something very, very generous in this, no? So it's this. There's which is getting lost the more formal we are expressing our speculative, our ordinary, our everyday things. The more formal we express it, the less generous we become with engaging with situations, no, instead of generalizations, with more, no, not either the singular or the object. So the thing is that things are mixed. so in languages are never.
Yeah. So it's about.
To say I look at the language as a system.
Yeah.
That is a choice, a cybernetic choice. It's not a necessity. So you can look at the language as all that can be articulated on the basis of a particular alphabet, and then it's clear that there can be many alphabets, and it's clear that the language loses words, invents words, so it dies and is natural in a way all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And there's even a sense that we can say this of galaxies and the sun. I mean, there are 1,000 suns, no? So why is it? So it seems to be an ultimate, but it's actually not that significant on the scale on which it is postulated. So every one of these cosmic bodies has a nature, in the sense of they are born and they can die. No? So the extinction of the sun, we say the extinction, that's as if some catastrophe which we cannot understand. But no, we can give it a date because we have an understanding how a sun accretes, how a planet accretes, and how they recycle, if you want, in the vastness of the universe. So that is a nature. That is not some kind of catastrophe which is miracle.
Well, we think it is, but that is more of just a reflection on, in a sense, the current trope of the Anthropocene, of thinking that, in a sense, we have reached a critical turning point in the Earth's ecology and so forth, that we have impacted as a species, we have impacted the future destiny of the Earth as on a planetary scale. This is, in a sense, moving this out around the concern for, in a sense, a certain, not only the human action or as an agency of doing that, but in a sense, that the Earth itself belongs to a system that itself is also finite. Yeah, so. Did you had your, you were going to say something else?
Yeah, concerning ontology and the semantic term, it's I was very interested in archaeology in the last couple of months, and I came to objects which makes for me evident that the ontological question is from the beginning of mankind. So it's the question of positioning the self in the universe.
Right.
And so I would say that this was the moment when the first artistic acts happened, and this was at the same time maybe when the language was developed.
Yeah.
So we cannot. So I think that this ontological thinking is prior to the language. So maybe there was.
Well, I mean, you can go back. Yeah, you can go back to. I mean, read Hobbes' Leviathan. Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan. The first chapter is on the origin of the construction. I mean, a lot of Bernard Stiegler's work lately has been talking about the origin of languages, but language is not reduced to alphabetic script or languages, but to mathematical symbols and so forth, letters, geometry. That the technological and the cultural creation of languages begins with these very early scripts, which have very different representations and very different functions that have poetic, pictorial, artistic, aesthetic.
Yeah, I think this. If you take the Greek language, which is the alphabet is
Right.
with numbers, this is really very much indicating the geometry and mathematics that the language was one.
Yeah.
And then the question comes: if you have this all these Greek and terms in philosophy now, yeah? It's like as if you have a perfect it turns out that in that time several millennia
Yeah.
prior to Plato there was already ontological theory.
This is a symbolic world that we're speaking, the creation of a symbolic world. And let me come back and just just clearly, I don't want to convey that I'm just picking on Quentin Meillassoux. I'm very interested, although I am a bit, but anyway, I'm very interested in why he creates or constructs this notion of an arca fossil as the fundamental basis or evidence or proof or example, proposition for his philosophy. But what is the arca fossil? Because it's not an organism that was alive once and then died and then was fossilized. Okay? He's not using any scientific paleontological example or evidence of an actual fossil. Okay? It's not something that even, it exists prior to humanity, but he says prior to life itself. How do we call it a fossil? I mean, how is it fossilized? What is it? What is this strange object that he created? This is a complete fiction or fantasy of something that never existed, that he created as something that existed before human beings. But it's not something that has any basis in any kind of scientific, archival, paleontological knowledge or specialized discipline. It's completely contradictory. It is a fossil, and yet it's never been an organism. It's never been alive. So this is what I'm calling attention to. It's the very contradictory status, which is in a sense, it's the creation. What he wanted to do is create a paradox upon which to press the claim for a form of givenness prior to the form of givenness, but in a sense, it is itself a highly formalistic, he could have used, I mean, there could have been other choices, actual choices of things that existed before humans existed, right? That you can actually derive from a record of organisms or of life forms. He didn't want to use a life form. Why? Why don't you want to use a life form of other than human? He didn't want to use any form of life because it is nothing, okay? It is a pure fiction, a pure logical formal language game. And at the base of that language game is a small thing which in a sense doesn't exist. So it's in some ways very funny if you look at any creation of any formalistic game or any formal language, any formal procedure, you will find at the kernel of that procedure is a certain contradiction of something that does not logically make sense. Yeah.
And the only problem with this is that he is using it in order to explain science. He's doing it as a philosopher. Because if you do this in science, I mean, that's how science goes. No? So you postulate, you give a word to an idea which you work out, so it appears completely unrealistic, it appears contradictory even, so it cannot yet be reasoned. So you give a pure fictional word to something which you think can be worked out. No? So to have...
Yeah, in science it would be like, okay, something existed. But in mathematics you can do that. You can posit irrational or unreal objects, basically unaxiomatized or axiomatized geometrical objects and something like that, and you can work them out.
Exactly. Every act of invention works like that.
But
fine. But if you do it in order to explain and found, as a foundational way, as a principal way, in order to explain the rest, then the gesture is completely inadequate.
But he's not talking to a scientific community.
That's what I mean, and that's what makes me angry about it.
And that's why I was laughing. That's why I was laughing when I said that you have to look at these contradictions and the chain of contradictions, because at one point he says the Arca Fossil does not have extension. What thing or object, how can you have an object without extension? Well, because it's reduced to a pure number, okay? So in a sense, a number is an ideal, or can be, in one theory, can be determined as an ideal form without extension. A purely spiritual form. So in a sense, but that in a sense creates...
That's the other point, no?
Yeah.
I mean, that goes, so this question of the theological or the religious, because if you really work with concepts that are explicitly, so that means he consciously reflects and says it's something that has no extension. Well, there is a long tradition of speaking of angels, no? As exactly that, the kind of forms of presence that have no body. So there is a huge, and then it's just so trivial, it's not even wrong of course, how could one say, but it's just completely unsophisticated and juvenile.
Yeah, but again, I didn't want to draw so much attention on the Meillassoux as being the total object, let's say, of the talk, but it's more the gesture itself, which is the creation of a positive or formal language within philosophy and of an ontology. But if you look at how the ontology is constructed, you see the exclusion of the body, the exclusion of certain things that happen at that point.
So maybe I was reading other articles where I was not conformed with this idea about mathematics, because I think he's too much believing in mathematicians.
Yeah, it's not a mathematics that would include certain higher forms of
It's not a contemporary.
Yeah, it's not a contemporary mathematics.
No, but this is very interesting.
Yeah. Other questions? Do we understand why planets don't speak?
If they do, you have to listen. There's nobody saying planets speak anymore.
Not like they used to. There's three reasons why planets don't speak. One, they don't have anything to say to us anymore. Two, they've been silenced, but I like that from Lacan. They've been silenced because their only role is to follow law. So, but that also problematizes, in a sense, like when Serre reanimates a certain tradition of in a sense, the Greek and the Roman and even pre-Roman understanding of, in a sense, the cosmology.
It's not like there was some kind of rational argument what mathematical law really, how we can understand what it is. Now,
Right.
in mathematics, we have no, there is no what the number is, what the force. So these are not questions that are somehow empirically now worked out, and we can start from them, so we can always interpret them. So yes, Plato can say the planets don't speak because they are all forced to follow laws now, but that's okay, it's a story, you can like it or not. But we can continue upstairs with some wine, perhaps.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you
Yeah.
very much.